The laughter started before Ruth Calder even raised her bidder card. 61 rusted branding irons lay tangled in a wooden crate at the edge of the county auction yard, their handles split, their heads black with age. Most people saw scrap metal. Boyd Mercer, the auctioneer, saw an easy joke. $5 for the whole mess, he called. Or should we pay somebody to haul it away? Ruth lifted her card. The ranchers along the fence laughed harder when she kept bidding against a scrap dealer and finally paid $61. $1 for every iron. Her nephew Daniel stood behind her with his jaw locked. That money was supposed to patch the farmhouse roof before the next storm. Instead, his 69-year-old aunt had bought tools no rancher had used in half a century. Ruth said nothing. She reached into the crate and pulled out one iron shaped like a crooked crescent crossed by two short bars. Her father had drawn that same mark in the margins of his old livestock ledger. By sunset, the story had spread across Calder County. The widow had finally lost her judgment. But the laughter would not truly stop until 3 days later, when Ruth brushed rust from the underside of that handle and found a courthouse file number stamped into the iron. When retired deed clerk Walter Sloan saw it, he locked the records room door. Then he asked Ruth where she had found the other 60. Because those irons had not merely marked cattle. They had once marked something the county had spent 80 years pretending never belonged to anyone at all. Stay with Ruth Calder for this story. Some things are called worthless only because the truth inside them is dangerous. Ruth had not bought 61 pieces of rust. She had bought the first clue to a secret that could save her ranch or destroy the last good memory of her family. The Calder County surplus auction was held on a hard September morning behind the old fairgrounds, where dust moved between pickup trucks and sunlight flashed off every sheet of metal. Ruth arrived 10 minutes before the first lot was called. She wore the same brown work coat she had owned for 20 years, one cuff frayed and a dark line of roofing tar across the sleeve. Daniel walked beside her carrying a folder from Holloway Development. Inside was an offer for Calder Ranch, good until 5 o'clock Friday. It would pay the back taxes, clear the equipment loan, replace the leaking roof, and leave enough for Ruth to move into a small house near town. It would also end 103 years of Calders living on that land. Daniel called it surviving. Ruth called it nothing. She passed rows of desks, fence panels, broken pumps, and county vehicles until she reached the final lots. That was where she saw the crate. The branding irons had been thrown together like dead branches. Some handles were burned smooth. Others were wrapped in old wire. Rust had swallowed most of the marks, leaving only crooked shadows in the iron. A yellow tag hung from the crate, found in collapsed Line Shack North parcel. Near the top lay the crescent mark. For 1 second, the auction yard disappeared. Ruth saw her father at the kitchen table in winter, his thick fingers moving across a livestock ledger. Whenever she entered, Eli Calder closed the book, but not before she saw that symbol beside columns of acreage and dates, a crescent crossed by two short bars. She had not seen it in 46 years. "Don't," Daniel said. Ruth looked at him. "Whatever you think that is, we don't need it." Before she could answer, Grant Holloway stepped beside them. He wore clean boots and a pale hat. His company had already purchased 3 ranches east of Calder Land. The brochures called the project Red Mesa Retreat. "Morning, Ruth," Grant said. He tapped the folder beneath Daniel's arm. "Friday comes quickly." Ruth kept looking at the crate. "Where's the north parcel?" "Old county strip above Dry Hollow. Nothing there but a fallen shack and mesquite." Was it ever part of Calder Ranch? Not according to the current map. Current. Ruth held on to that word. Boyd Mercer climbed onto the platform and began moving through the last lots. When he reached the crate, only a few buyers remained nearby. "Here's something for the historians," Boyd called. "A full collection of tetanus." The crowd laughed. $5. Ruth raised her card. A scrap dealer offered 10. Ruth bid 15. Boyd grinned. "Mrs. Calder, planning to start your own cattle empire?" More laughter. The dealer bid 25. Ruth said 30. Daniel stepped close. "The roof leaks over your bed." "I know. The tax notice is on the refrigerator." "I know. Holloway's offer expires Friday." "I know that too." The bidding climbed to $55. The scrap dealer looked into the crate and offered 60. Ruth lifted her card. 61. Boyd blinked. $61? "One for each iron," Ruth said. The auctioneer struck the rail. "Sold to Ruth Calder, who has officially bought rust by the piece. The laughter came again, but Ruth was no longer listening. She knelt and pulled out the crescent iron. Beneath the rust, along one side of its head, she felt two shallow cuts her father had once drawn beside the same mark. Grant Holloway was watching her. Not laughing, watching. "What did you find?" Daniel asked. Ruth wrapped the iron in an old feed sack. "I don't know yet, and if it's nothing..." Ruth glanced at the yellow tag. "Found in collapsed line shack, North Parcel." "Then, Friday changes nothing," she said. The crate was loaded into Daniel's truck. They drove home without speaking. Passing the first Red Mesa survey stakes, hammered into land that had belonged to neighbors Daniel remembered from childhood. At the farmhouse, Ruth carried the crescent iron into the kitchen. The room smelled of dust, coffee grounds, and damp plaster from the ceiling that had waited too long to be repaired. Then she opened Eli Calder's old ledger beneath the window. The crescent mark appeared on page 17. Beside it, her father had written 3 words in fading pencil. "Keep them together." The next page had been torn out. Rain began just after midnight. It found the weak places in the Calder farmhouse the way it always did. A slow tap above Ruth's bedroom, a darker line spreading across the kitchen ceiling. Water gathering at the corner of the window Eli had once promised to replace before winter. Ruth placed a saucepan beneath the first leak and a coffee tin beneath the second. The branding irons remained in Daniel's truck under a canvas tarp. She had brought only the crescent iron inside. It rested on the kitchen table beside Eli's ledger, leaving a faint trail of rust on the oilcloth. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching the rain strike the porch. "You could still call Holloway in the morning," he said. Ruth kept her eyes on the torn page. "He said Friday. It is Thursday now. I know what day it is." Daniel pressed both hands against the back of a chair. "The roof is not the only thing. The east well pump is failing. We are behind on taxes. The tractor needs a transmission. You cannot keep solving one emergency by ignoring the next." Ruth closed the ledger. "Your grandfather did." "No. Grandpa left you a ranch that was already tired." The words landed harder because they were true. For most of Ruth's childhood, Eli Calder had seemed capable of holding the entire property together with baling wire, patience, and hands that never quite came clean. He repaired gates after supper. He sharpened mower blades beneath a single hanging bulb. He could hear a dry bearing from across a field. But there was one thing he never repaired in front of Ruth: the family books. Every Sunday evening, after Ruth's mother, Miriam, went to bed, Eli sat at the kitchen table with the livestock ledger, county tax slips, and a small wooden ruler. He copied numbers into columns. Sometimes he drew symbols beside them: diamonds, split circles, hooks, bars, and the crooked crescent Ruth had seen at the auction. When Ruth was 10, she asked what the marks meant. Eli closed the ledger. "Some folks sign with ink," he said. "Some sign with what they have." She had assumed he meant cattle brands. For nearly 60 years, she had never questioned it. Daniel laid the Holloway folder on the table. "Read the last page." "I already have." The offer included a life-use clause allowing Ruth to remain in the farmhouse for 12 months after the sale. Grant called it generous. Daniel called it enough time to find somewhere safe. Ruth understood what safe meant. A smaller house, no livestock, no fields where every fence post carried a memory. She also understood what the offer did not say. Once she signed, Holloway could begin grading the north boundary within 30 days. Nothing mentioned the collapsed line shack. Nothing mentioned why Grant had stopped smiling when Ruth lifted the crescent iron. "You always said Grandpa taught you not to confuse memory with value," Daniel said. "He taught me not to throw something away before I understood what it did." "And what does that do?" "I don't know." "That answer should matter." "It does. Not enough." Ruth looked at him. Daniel was not trying to take the ranch from her. He was trying to keep it from taking the rest of her. The ranch was not merely her past. It was the largest thing Daniel had ever been promised. Now she was asking him to risk it over a mark in a dead man's book. "I need one day," Ruth said. "At 5 tomorrow, I call Holloway. And if I have nothing, I will listen." Daniel gave a tired laugh. "That is not the same as agreeing." "No," Ruth said. "It isn't." He left before dawn. Ruth remained at the table while the storm moved east. When the rain softened, she opened the ledger again. Page 17 held the crescent mark beside 3 acreage figures: 40, 2, 70, 6, and 118. 2 names had been written beneath them, then scratched out so heavily that only the final letters remained: Ard. Lay. Below the names, Eli had drawn a line toward the missing page. Ruth searched the rest of the ledger. The marks appeared 14 more times, always beside acreage, never beside cattle counts. Some had courthouse abbreviations in the margin. Others carried dates from the years immediately after 1934. The final entry was from November 1979. That date stopped her. Miriam Calder had entered St. Agnes Hospital in October 1979 with a failing heart valve. Eli had been 2 payments behind on the mortgage. Ruth remembered foreclosure notices beside the bread box. She remembered her father selling cabs too early and driving to town in the same shirt for 3 days. Then, without explanation, the notices stopped coming. Miriam received the surgery. The bank never foreclosed. Eli told Ruth that an old livestock investment had finally paid. She had believed him because she needed to. Ruth carried the ledger to the hall closet and pulled down the metal deed box. Inside were tax receipts, Miriam's hospital bill, and a mortgage release stamped the 3rd of December 1979. Paid and satisfied in full. No payment amount appeared. No source of funds was listed. On the back, in Eli's handwriting, were 5 words Ruth had never seen before. Keep the marks together. County knows. Her father had not merely recognized the symbols. He had connected them to the county. And whatever he learned in 1979 had appeared at the exact moment Calder Ranch was about to be taken from him. Ruth sat alone in the hallway, the mortgage release trembling between her fingers. For the first time in her life, the memory of Eli Calder did not feel like shelter. It felt like a locked door. At sunrise, she carried the crescent iron to the workbench, poured oil into a shallow pan, and began removing the rust from the handle. Before noon, the first number appeared. By 8 that morning, Ruth had moved all 61 branding irons into Eli's old workshop. She laid them across the scarred workbench in 6 uneven rows, placing a square of brown paper beneath each one. On every sheet, she wrote a temporary number in pencil. Daniel stood in the doorway with a cup of coffee. "They already have numbers," he said, "not ones we understand." Ruth poured penetrating oil into 3 shallow pans. She had no intention of grinding the irons clean or stripping away every trace of age. Eli had taught her that careless restoration could destroy more than rust. She began with the crescent mark. A soft wire brush loosened the orange scale around the head. Beneath it, the iron was darker and smoother than she expected. The mark itself had not been welded from a commercial pattern. Someone had shaped it by hand. 2 short bars crossed the crescent at slightly different angles. Ruth opened Eli's ledger to page 17. The angles matched. She placed the iron on brown paper marked number 1. The remaining 60 did not form a normal ranch collection. Some brands were simple: a diamond, a hook, a broken square. Others were more personal: a bird with 1 bent wing, 3 lines joined like a wheat shock, a circle cut open at the top. One appeared to be nothing more than a backward letter R, but the lower leg had been hammered flat as though its maker wanted it distinguished from an ordinary initial. The handles told another story. Several were made from ash, others from oak, cedar, and cottonwood. Some carried careful leather wraps. One had been repaired with copper wire. Another had a child-sized handprint burned faintly into the wood near the grip. These objects had not come from one blacksmith. They had come from many households. Ruth wrote down the wood type, the shape, the length, and every unusual cut. She found traces of red paint on 4 handles and blue thread tied beneath 7 grips. Daniel eventually set down his coffee and began helping. He photographed each head against a ruler, then entered the visible marks into the state livestock database. The first search returned nothing. So did the second. By noon, they had checked 26. "No active registrations," Daniel said. "They're old. The database includes historical brands. Not all of them. It goes back to the 1880s. Ruth continued brushing the iron shaped like the broken square. A strip of metal near its handle looked thicker than the rest. She turned it toward the window and saw 3 shallow characters hidden beneath the corrosion. K. 14. She stopped. The crescent iron had carried a longer set of numbers. At first, Ruth had assumed they were measurements or a blacksmith's inventory code. Now she cleaned the same location on the next 4 irons. Si-hai mui-hai, de-su, de-nitten, F-tree. The letters progressed in groups. The numbers did not. Daniel photographed them and searched the livestock database again. No match. Ruth retrieved the mortgage release from 1979. The county stamp in the upper corner read, Archive Series C, File 118. She set it beside the crescent iron. The number under its handle was C118. Daniel leaned closer. That could be coincidence. 5 coincidences? It could be a maker system. Then why does it match a county archive series? He had no answer. They cleaned the remaining irons more carefully. 58 carried a letter and number combination. 2 had only numbers. 1, the backward R had been filed smooth beneath the handle. Someone had deliberately removed its code. Ruth arranged the irons by letter. Series A contained 8 marks. Series B contained 11. Series C contained 14. Series D contained 9. Series E contained 12. Series F contained 7. The numbers skipped unpredictably. C118 sat between C42 and C76. In Eli's ledger, those same 3 acreage figures appeared beside the crescent symbol. Fortithway, 76. 118. Ruth felt the room narrow around her. These aren't livestock numbers, she said. Daniel looked at the rows of iron. Then what are they? Ruth closed the ledger before answering. Land files. Daniel pushed his chair back. Branding irons are not deeds. I didn't say they were. You are building a story from scratches. I'm following what your grandfather left. And Grandpa might have been wrong. Ruth met his eyes. It was the first time either of them had said that aloud. Daniel searched the county newspaper archive instead. He entered the location of the collapsed line shack, the year 1934, and the phrase cattle brand. Most results concerned sales, missing calves, and fence disputes. Then a headline appeared from March 1935. County breaks old brand running ring. The article named no suspects. It described a group of unregistered stockmen accused of moving cattle across the north parcels and replacing lawful brands with private marks. The sheriff claimed dozens of illegal branding irons had been seized. No trial was mentioned. No convictions appeared in later issues. The cattle vanished from the reports. So did the people accused of stealing them. Daniel read the article twice. These could be the seized irons. Ruth studied the photograph printed beneath the headline. 6 men stood in front of the old courthouse. Behind them, a wagon carried a wooden rack. The image was grainy, but Ruth could see rows of long handles rising from it. 61 holes had been cut into the rack inside the collapsed line shack. Perhaps the irons had belonged to thieves. Perhaps Eli had spent years recording evidence of a crime. That explanation was simple enough for the county to accept. It was also simple enough to be dangerous. Ruth looked again at the article. The 6 men wore work clothes, but none wore handcuffs. 2 held their hats against their chests. An older man stood beside a woman carrying a baby. They did not look like a captured criminal gang. They looked like families waiting to be told where they were allowed to go. At the bottom of the article, one sentence had been printed beneath a crease. The disputed north parcels will be reassigned after legal ownership is reviewed. Reassigned to whom? Ruth asked. Daniel searched the following month. Then the month after that, nothing. The county archive index showed that the related files had been destroyed in the courthouse fire. Ruth placed the crescent iron in the feed sack. Where are you going? To see Walter Sloan. He has been retired for 15 years. He still volunteers in the records office on Thursdays. Daniel glanced toward the window. Grant Holloway's folder remained on the kitchen table inside the house. You have until 5. I remember. Walter was alone when Ruth entered the basement records room. He smiled when he recognized her. Then Ruth removed the crescent iron from the sack and placed it on his desk. The smile disappeared. His eyes moved from the mark to the number beneath the handle. Go 118. Walter stood slowly, crossed the room, and locked the door. Then he lowered the blinds over the narrow basement window. Who else has seen these? He asked. My nephew. Anyone from the auction? Everyone at the auction. Walter closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he was no longer looking at Ruth. He was looking at the past. Tell me you did not bring the other 60 into this building. Ruth tightened her hand around the feed sack. Why? Walter reached for the telephone, stopped, and pulled his hand away. Because the last time those marks were together, he said, 61 families still existed on the county map. And before Ruth could ask what had happened to them, footsteps sounded on the stairs outside the locked records room door. The footsteps stopped outside the records room door. Walter's face changed before the knock came. Mr. Sloane, a woman called. Why is this door locked? Walter slid the crescent iron toward Ruth. Put it away. He opened the door to Helen Voss, the county attorney. Her charcoal suit looked untouched by the dust outside. Her eyes moved from Walter to Ruth, then to the feed sack on the desk. Mrs. Calder, she said, I heard you had questions about an auction lot. Ruth stayed in her chair. I asked about 3 files. C-42, C-76, C-118. Helen's expression remained calm, but Walter looked down. Those numbers do not correspond to active deed records. They correspond to something. Old county notations can refer to tax reviews, equipment inventories, easements, livestock disputes. You cannot assign meaning to them because they appear on farm iron. I asked to see the files. The series was listed as destroyed in the 1934 courthouse fire. The article about the brands was printed in 1935. Helen paused. Then it may refer to a later system. May? Helen folded her hands. I am trying to prevent you from making a claim that could damage your property and anyone considering a lawful purchase nearby. Grant Holloway's offer was not supposed to be part of this conversation. Yet there it was. Ruth lifted the feed sack. I have made no public claim. Good. Keep it that way until the county can determine whether the objects are authentic. Walter spoke. They're authentic. Helen turned. You have not examined the full collection. I don't need all 60, one to recognize that mark. The silence carried years. Helen's voice cooled. Then explain how. Walter looked at Ruth. I was a junior clerk when old index cards were transferred to microfilm. Certain series were not copied. By accident? Ruth asked. He did not answer. Helen placed a business card beside the telephone. If the irons are connected to missing county property, the county may have a duty to secure them. They sat in a collapsed shack until the handles rotted. The county did not know they were there. Walter's hand tightened against the desk. Ruth noticed the wording. Helen had not said the county did not know what the irons were, only that it did not know where they were. Ruth left before anyone could ask her to surrender the crescent iron. Daniel waited by the truck. What happened? They said the records burned. They also said the county may own the irons. Do they? I bought them legally. That was not my question. Ruth put the sack behind the seat. I need to see the line shack. Daniel checked his watch. Holloway moved the signing meeting to 3. He cannot move a deadline we never accepted. He can withdraw the offer. That is what deadlines are for. Daniel drove north without answering. The old county strip lay beyond Dry Hollow, where pavement narrowed into 2 dusty ruts. Orange Holloway survey ribbons already flickered along the lower ridge. The collapsed shack stood half a mile beyond the current Calder fence. Its roof had folded inward. One wall leaned against a dead cottonwood. Inside, Ruth found the wooden rack beneath a fallen beam. It was 6 feet long, with rows of circular holes cut into its face. 61 holes. Each had a small rectangular recess beneath it, as though a paper label had once sat below every iron. Daniel knelt near the bottom row. One still has something. The paper had fused to the wood. Ruth dampened it and lifted it with her pocket knife. 4 letters survived. Ward. Beneath the name was a parcel notation. N-Mui-Hai. Daniel photographed it. Could be a last name. It is. You don't know that. No, Ruth said. But your grandfather did. She opened Eli's ledger to the scratched-out names. One ended in Ard. Tires crushed gravel outside. Grant Holloway stepped from a white truck carrying a new contract folder. He looked at the rack, the paper in Ruth's hand, and the open ledger. I hoped we could settle this before it became complicated. It was complicated before you arrived. Grant glanced at Daniel. The revised offer clears every debt, gives Ruth lifetime occupancy, and pays you enough to start over. Daniel did not take the folder. What changed? Nothing. We are keeping the schedule. Ruth held up the scrap. Who owned North Parcel 12? Grant's pause was small but clear. I would have to check. You already did. He closed the folder. Old maps overlap. Names change. Boundaries move. If you dig through every mistake made before your grandparents were born, no title in this county will look clean. That sounds like a warning. It is practical advice. Grant placed the contract on Daniel's hood. 3 o'clock. After that, Red Mesa moves west, and your access road becomes a separate negotiation. That was the new threat. Even if Ruth kept the ranch, Holloway could surround it. Grant drove away, leaving the contract beneath a stone. Daniel stared after him. He knew the parcel number. Yes. And he can make the ranch harder to reach. Yes. Daniel looked at the ruined shack. This is what you wanted? Proof the problem is bigger? No. I wanted proof I wasn't imagining it. On the drive home, Daniel searched county directories. Only one Ward family remained near Dry Hollow. Lena Ward, age 82. Her address stood less than 2 miles from land, now fenced inside Calder Ranch. At 2:47, Daniel turned away from Holloway's office. He did not say he believed Ruth. He only asked, "Do you want me to call Mrs. Ward first?" Ruth looked at the contract on the dashboard. "No," she said. "Some doors should be knocked on in person." For the first time since the auction, Daniel drove past the deadline without looking back. Lena Ward's house stood at the end of a gravel road, lined with cottonwoods and rusted fence wire. It was small, white, and carefully kept. A blue enamel basin sat beneath the rain barrel. 3 rows of rosemary grew beside the porch. Daniel parked beneath a pecan tree. Ruth remained in the truck with the feed sack across her knees. "You want me to come in?" Daniel asked. "Yes. You think she knows what the mark means?" "I think she knows what it meant to her family." Lena opened the door before they knocked. She was 82, silver-haired, and steadier than Ruth expected. Her eyes went first to Ruth, then to the feed sack. "Calder," she said. Ruth nodded. "My father was Eli. I know who your father was." Ruth held out the scrap from the line shack. "Where did you get that?" Lena asked. "North Parcel 12. That parcel has not been called that in 70 years. Lena stepped aside. The sitting room smelled of cedar and old paper. Family photographs covered one wall. In nearly every picture, people stood beside cattle, wagon wheels, fences, or low stone houses. "What do you want?" Lena asked. "The truth. Your family has had the land. Most people decide that is enough." Ruth removed the crescent iron. "This one is not yours. But one of the other marks may be." Lena crossed to a cedar chest and lifted out a small wooden box. The lid carried a burned mark, shaped like a wheat stem beneath a half circle. Ruth had cleaned that same mark that morning. Number 37, Series D, File N12. Lena touched the scar in the wood. "My grandmother could read a little, but she could not write her name well enough for courthouse men. When they needed her signature, she made this mark." "With the branding iron?" Daniel asked. "With whatever would leave it." Inside the box lay a photograph, a tax receipt, and a narrow strip of paper. The photograph showed 3 generations standing before a stone well. The wheat stem mark had been painted on its cover. On the back, someone had written, "Ward Place, North 12. Spring still good." Ruth knew that well. It stood inside Calder's west pasture, hidden behind cedar growth and a fence Eli had built when she was a child. He had always said the stones were unsafe. Lena unfolded the receipt. "Received from Samuel and Anna Ward, taxes for the year 1933, parcel N12, 118 acres. At the bottom, where a signature should have been, sat the wheat stem mark. "Accepted by mark in place of signature." Daniel read it twice. "This proves the county knew who paid for the land before the courthouse burned." "Yes," Lena said. "What happened after the fire?" Ruth asked. "They said the deed was gone. Then they said my grandparents could not prove the land belonged to them. The sheriff called them cattle thieves because their brands were not in the new registry. The newspaper said the cattle were moved. They were. By the county." Lena sought. "The cattle were sold to cover taxes my grandparents had already paid. My mother was 11. She remembered the wagon more than the eviction. Her father loaded blankets, a stove lid, and that box. He left the kitchen table because there was no room." Ruth looked at the cedar chest. Lena had not preserved these things to win a case. She had kept them because they were the last objects her mother carried away from home. Quiet love often looked like storage. A box protected from damp. A photograph labeled so someone would remember where the well had stood. A receipt folded carefully enough to survive people who wanted it gone. Daniel studied a photograph of a little girl beside the stone well. "Your mother?" Lena nodded. "That well is still there," he said. Lena's face changed. "Still?" "Grandpa fenced it off. He never filled it." Ruth remembered Eli repairing that fence even when no cattle grazed nearby. Perhaps guilt had kept the well standing. Or perhaps love had. She was no longer sure the two could be separated. "I found 61 irons," Ruth said. Lena's composure broke. 61 marks? "Yes." "And the Ward iron?" "At my house. My mother searched for it until she died." Ruth did not offer an apology too small for the moment. Instead, she asked, "Will you come identify it?" Lena studied her. "If I do, and that receipt proves what I think it proves, what happens to the West pasture?" Daniel answered first. "We do not know." Lena nodded. "Good. People who already know the ending usually are not looking for the truth." She allowed Ruth to photograph the receipt but kept the original. Trust had not been offered, only a narrow door. As they left, Daniel paused. "My family took your land." "Maybe," Lena said. "Maybe courthouse men did it and your family accepted what followed. Those are not the same sin. They end at the same fence." "Yes, they do." Daniel drove to the west pasture before returning home. The old stone well remained behind Eli's patched fence. "He kept it," Daniel said. "He kept many things." "To protect them?" "Sometimes." "And the other times?" Ruth looked toward the workshop where 61 irons waited. Sometimes keeping something is only another way of being afraid to return it. Before leaving, Ruth photographed the well and sent it to Lena. The reply came 3 minutes later. "My mother was right. It survived." Then Ruth's phone rang. Helen Voss was calling from the county attorney's office. A court order had been filed. By sunset, Ruth would be required to surrender every branding iron and every copy of the records they had found. Helen Voss arrived at Calder Ranch before the sun dropped behind the west ridge. A sheriff's cruiser followed her through the gate. Daniel stood beside the workshop when they parked. Ruth came out carrying Eli's ledger beneath one arm. Helen held up a folded order. "This authorizes the county to secure the branding irons and related county records pending authentication." "They are not county records," Ruth said. "The numbering suggests otherwise. The county abandoned them in a collapsed shack. That does not establish ownership." The sheriff, Amos Reed, removed his hat. He had known Ruth since high school and looked as uncomfortable as she felt. "I am here to keep the inventory peaceful," he said. "Then keep it accurate." Helen entered the workshop with 2 county employees. They wore gloves and carried evidence tags, cameras, and hard plastic cases. Ruth watched them move along the rows. Each iron was photographed. Each temporary number Ruth had written was replaced by a county tag. One by one, the objects stopped looking like things returned from the past and began looking like items being taken away from it again. Lena Ward arrived before the first case was closed. She carried the original 1,933 tax receipt inside a plastic sleeve. Helen looked at it but did not touch it. "That document is not included in the order." "Good," Lena said. "Then it stays with me." One of the employees lifted the wheat stem iron. Lena stepped forward. "My grandmother signed with that mark." Helen's expression remained measured. "That has not been legally established. She paid taxes with it. We will examine the evidence. You have had 80 years. The sheriff lowered his eyes. Ruth did not intervene. Lena had spent a lifetime waiting to say those words to someone who represented the county. The employees sealed the first case. Ruth read the order again. It listed all branding irons, copies of tax records, photographs from the line shack, and any documents derived from county property. It did not mention Eli's livestock ledger. It did not mention the mortgage release. And it did not authorize a search of the farmhouse. Helen noticed Ruth reading. "You are required to preserve all related materials." "I will preserve them. That means you cannot conceal, destroy, transfer, or alter them." "I understand English." Helen stepped closer. "Mrs. Calder, this is no longer a private family inquiry. If you interfere with the order, the county may seek sanctions. If these objects are found to have been removed from public custody, criminal questions could follow." There it was. Not an accusation. A shape left open for Ruth to fear. Daniel heard it too. Criminal questions against whom? Helen looked at him. "Anyone involved in withholding county property. We bought them at a county auction. That fact will be considered." Considered? Ruth touched Daniel's arm before anger carried him farther. The final case was sealed at 6:14. The county employees loaded all 61 irons into a van. As the doors closed, Lena stood beside Ruth. "My mother waited 70 years for one of those to come home." Ruth watched the van leave. "And now the county has it again." "No," Lena said. "Now they know we know it exists." That difference mattered, but not enough. Grant Holloway arrived less than 20 minutes later. He did not enter the workshop. He stayed near the porch with a document folder tucked beneath his arm. Helen's car had barely disappeared down the road. "You work quickly," Ruth said. "I heard the county was securing evidence." From whom? People talk. County attorneys? Grant ignored the question. The Red Mesa Board has authorized one final offer. Daniel laughed without humor. You always seem to have a final offer. This one is different. The document cleared every Calder debt. It granted Ruth lifetime possession of the farmhouse and 5 surrounding acres. Daniel would receive a cash payment large enough to purchase another property. In return, Ruth would sell the remaining ranch immediately. A second clause required both Ruth and Daniel to waive future title claims and assign any interest in historical land disputes to Holloway Development. Daniel read the clause twice. You are buying the lawsuit. I am buying certainty. You already knew there was a title problem. I knew old rural titles are rarely perfect. You knew about North 12. Grant's face hardened. Take the offer. The county has the irons now. Whatever story you think they tell, will spend years in court. Meanwhile, your taxes remain unpaid. Ruth closed the folder. And what happens to the Ward acreage? It becomes part of the development, even if it was stolen? If every historical injustice voided a modern deed, half the country would stop moving. Lena stood near the workshop door. Maybe some of it should. Grant turned and recognized her name before she introduced herself. That was all Ruth needed to see. He had studied the families, not just the parcels. Ruth handed back the folder. No. Daniel started at her. Grant did not argue. He looked at Daniel instead. You should understand what this means for you. If the ranch enters a title action, inheritance can be frozen. Property can sit unusable for years. Legal fees will consume whatever remains. I understand, Daniel said, but his voice had changed. After Grant left, Daniel walked into the kitchen and placed both hands on the table. You rejected 5 acres and lifetime occupancy. I rejected a waiver. You rejected the only way to guarantee you keep this house. It guaranteed silence. It guaranteed you would not end up with nothing. Ruth set Eli's ledger between them. You think I do not know what nothing looks like? I think you are deciding that for both of us. The words reopened everything they had avoided. Daniel had returned because the ranch was failing. He had spent months negotiating taxes, loans, and repairs. The inheritance he once imagined was already shrinking. Now Ruth was asking him to surrender even the remainder for families he had never met. You said you would listen, if you found nothing, he said. I found something. You found enough to destroy us. Not enough to win. Ruth looked toward the empty workshop. That may be true. Daniel stepped back, as though the honesty hurt more than another argument. Then what are you asking me to choose? I am not asking you yet. That is worse. He left the kitchen. Ruth heard his truck start, then fade down the road. For the first time, he did not tell her when he would return. Darkness settled over the farmhouse. Ruth opened Eli's ledger again, searching for anything she had missed. Near the final pages, several entries had been cut away close to the binding. Her phone rang. Walter Sloan spoke before she could say hello. The county has the irons? Yes. Then they will compare the marks to the surviving index. What surviving index? The public one is incomplete. And the complete one? Walter was silent long enough for Ruth to hear his breathing. There was a second register. Original names, replacement deeds, approvals. Your father knew where it went. Where? I never saw the hiding place. But in 1979, Eli told me one thing. Ruth waited. Walter lowered his voice. He said the county could take the iron, but it would never find the wall that remembered. The line went dead. Ruth stood alone in the kitchen. Then she looked toward the pantry wall Eli had rebuilt the winter her mother came home from surgery. The pantry wall had been painted 4 times since 1979. Ruth remembered every color. Yellow when Miriam came home from the hospital. White after Eli died. Pale green when Daniel was a boy and knocked a jar of blackberry preserves across the floor. White again when Ruth could no longer bear looking at the stains beneath the paint. She removed the shelves first. Behind the lowest bracket, one screw was newer than the others. Eli had used a square-headed fastener in a wall built almost entirely with nails. Ruth found his old screwdriver in the workshop. The panel resisted until she slipped a putty knife along its edge. Dry plaster cracked. A strip of wood pulled free. Behind it was a space no wider than her hand. Inside sat a flat metal box wrapped in waxed cloth. Ruth placed it on the kitchen table. For several minutes, she did not open it. The farmhouse was silent without Daniel. Even the clock seemed louder. Each tick reminded her that the house might soon belong to no Calder at all. She unwrapped the cloth. The box, contained a leather-bound register, 3 folded maps, 27 carbon copies of county forms, and an envelope addressed in Eli's handwriting. For Ruth, she opened the register first. The pages were arranged by mark. Each branding symbol appeared beside a family name, parcel number, acreage, tax status, and a second column labeled replacement owner. Ward, Samuel, and Anna. Parcel N.C. 118 acres. Replacement owner, Thomas Calder. Ruth stopped breathing for a moment. Thomas had been Eli's father, her grandfather. She continued. Other names appeared beside ranches she knew. Mercer, Holloway, Bell, Stroud, Vale. Some replacement owners had received small pieces of land. Others had gained hundreds of acres. Approval initials appeared at the bottom of each transfer. County clerk, bank representative, sheriff, 3 ranch witnesses. The register did not describe an accident caused by a courthouse fire. It documented a system. The original family's marks had been removed from the surviving files. Substitute deeds were then issued to people who could sign their names and obtain bank approval. The branding irons had not been hidden because they were useless. They had been hidden because they could reconnect every erased mark to a living family and a piece of land. Ruth unfolded Eli's letter. She read only the first page. He wrote that he discovered the register and irons in 1979 while repairing the abandoned line shack. He had taken the register home before county officials could collect it. Then Miriam's hospital bills arrived. The bank offered to release the Calder mortgage if Eli returned the register and said nothing about the irons. He returned neither. But he stayed silent. The mortgage disappeared anyway. Eli believed someone at the bank had assumed he would eventually surrender the evidence. When he did not, they watched him, pressured him, and waited. He hid the register behind the pantry wall. He separated it from the irons because no single piece of evidence could prove the entire scheme alone. At the end of the first page, Eli had written, "I told myself keeping it safe was the same as doing right. It was not." Ruth folded the letter. She could not read the rest yet, not because she feared learning something worse about Eli, because she already understood enough. Her father had preserved the truth. He had also allowed another generation to live without it. Ruth walked through the farmhouse room by room. She began with practical things. Winter coats, medicina, Miriam's blue mixing bowl, 2 framed photographs, Eli's pocket knife. She placed them into cardboard boxes and wrote her name on each one. She left the heavy furniture where it stood. The walnut table had belonged to Thomas Calder. If the land beneath the house entered a title dispute, Ruth was no longer certain which parts of the family legacy she had the moral right to carry away. She packed only what no court could mistake for acreage. By noon, 7 boxes stood beside the front door. Then, she returned to the register. Ruth photographed every page. She copied the files onto 3 drives. One went into an envelope for Lena Ward. One went beneath the spare tire in her truck. The third, she mailed to a legal aid office in another county, with instructions not to open it unless she called. She made a list of all 61 families. Some names had no obvious descendants. Others still appeared on mailboxes, church records, and cemetery stones. Ruth placed the list beside Eli's letter. At 3:15, Daniel's truck came through the gate. He entered the house and stopped when he saw the boxes. "What are you doing?" "Preparing." "For what?" "To leave." Daniel looked toward the pantry. Plaster covered the floor. The hidden box sat open on the table. "You found it." "Yes." "Does it prove the Ward claim?" "It proves more than that." He read the first page of the register. Then the second. When he reached the Calder entry, he sat down. 118 acres. That is only the Ward parcel. How much of the ranch is disputed? I have not finished adding it. Daniel turned another page. His face hardened when he saw the replacement owner column. "You packed before you told me. I did not know whether you were coming back. You could have called. You needed time to decide what you were willing to lose. And you decided for me again." "No." Ruth placed the list of families in front of him. "This time I decided only what I am willing to lose." Daniel looked at the boxes. "The house? If necessary. The ranch? If it never belonged to us. And Grandpa?" Ruth touched Eli's letter. "I cannot keep only the parts of him that make loving him easy." Daniel lowered his eyes. For a long time, neither spoke. Then he noticed the empty space beside the door. "You packed 7 boxes. That is enough. You lived here 69 years. That does not mean everything inside belongs in the next place. Daniel walked to the window overlooking the west pasture. The ward well stood beyond the cedar line. "I thought you were trying to save the ranch," he said. "So did I. What are you trying to save now?" Ruth looked at the register, the chance for everyone else to choose with the truth in front of them. A county vehicle stopped at the mailbox. The driver left an official envelope and departed. Inside was notice of an emergency public hearing scheduled for the following afternoon. Helen Voss would present the county's request to retain the branding irons and seal all related records during authentication. Grant Holloway had also petitioned to proceed with the Red Mesa purchase under the existing title. Ruth's name appeared under interested parties. Lena Ward's did not. Neither did the names of the other 60 families. Daniel read the notice. They plan to decide before anyone else knows. Ruth placed the second register inside Eli's old leather case. Then we will make sure they know. The next afternoon, Ruth would enter the county hall carrying enough evidence to dismantle her own inheritance. For the first time, she was no longer preparing to defend the Calder name. She was preparing to tell the county what that name had cost everyone else. The county meeting room had 48 chairs. By the time Ruth arrived, more than 80 people were standing inside. Some had heard about the branding irons from the auction. Others had seen Lena Ward's photograph of the stone well. Several carried old tax slips, family Bibles, faded maps, or boxes that had not been opened in years. The county commissioners sat behind a raised wooden desk. Helen Voss stood at one table with 3 sealed evidence cases. Grant Holloway stood at another with maps of the proposed Red Mesa development. Ruth entered carrying Eli's leather case. Daniel walked several steps behind her. He had not yet said what he intended to do. Helen opened the hearing by describing the issue as a question of evidence, custody, and title stability. She did not mention 61 erased families. She did not mention the second register. The county requests continued possession of the recovered objects, while authentication proceeds, she said. We also ask that unverified claims not be allowed to interfere with existing lawful transactions. Grant rose immediately. Holloway Development entered negotiations in good faith. Delaying the purchase of Calder Ranch based on unproven artifacts would create unnecessary economic harm. He displayed a map showing roads, cabins, a golf course, and a blue artificial lake. Parcel N12 appeared beneath the proposed lake. Lena Ward saw it. "That is where my mother's house stood." Grant kept his attention on the commissioners. With respect, family recollections cannot replace recorded title. Ruth opened Eli's case. "No," she said. "But recorded title can be compared with the record used to create it." The room quieted. Helen stood. "Mrs. Calder, if you possess additional county material, I advise you not to display it until its custody can be established. This was hidden in my house. That does not determine lawful ownership. It determines who did not want the county to find it." Ruth placed the second register on the public table. Walter Sloan was seated in the back row. When he saw the cover, he removed his glasses. Helen requested a recess. Ruth refused to move the book. One commissioner asked Walter whether he recognized it. He walked forward slowly. "That is the transfer register," he said. Helen turned toward him. "You cannot authenticate it by sight. I copied pages from it when I was 23. A murmur moved through the room. Walter faced the commissioners. The public index was created from that register. The original owners were left out. Replacement deeds were copied. The branding marks were not. "Who ordered that?" a commissioner asked. Walter looked at Helen, then at the sealed cases. County Clerk Horace Bell. Bank Attorney Franklin Mercer. Sheriff Wade Holloway. Grant's expression tightened at the sound of his family name. Walter continued. "I told myself I was only a junior clerk. Later, I told myself the records were already gone. Both explanations were easier than admitting I helped make people disappear on paper." Helen said nothing. Ruth opened the register to parcel N12. She read Samuel and Anna Ward's names, the 118 acres, the tax status, and the replacement owner, Thomas Calder. Every face in the room turned toward her. Ruth did not look away. "My family received this land." Lena stepped forward, carrying the 1,933 tax receipt. "My grandparents paid for it." Helen examined the receipt beside the register. The wheat stem mark appeared in both places. Then Lena pointed toward the sealed evidence cases. "The iron carrying that mark is in there." Other people began approaching the table. An elderly man carried a photograph of a barn bearing a broken square symbol. A woman from Dry Hollow opened a family Bible and showed a diamond mark beside her great-grandfather's name. A mechanic placed an old water-right receipt beneath the hook-shaped mark copied from Ruth's photographs. The room stopped looking like a hearing. It became a reunion between names and objects that had been kept apart for 80 years. Helen ordered the clerk to record every document submitted. Grant stepped toward Daniel. "This is your last chance." He placed the purchase contract on the table. "If the commission freezes these titles, the Calder estate may remain tied up for a decade. Your aunt could lose the house. You could lose everything she intended to leave you." Daniel looked at Ruth's 7 boxes stacked beside the farmhouse door in his memory. Then he looked at parcel N12 beneath the blue lake on Grant's development map. "What happens if I sign? We close before the title action expands." "And the ward claim?" "Holloway assumes the risk." "That is not what I asked." Grant lowered his voice. "The project proceeds." Daniel picked up the contract. For a second, Ruth thought he might sign. Instead, he tore the signature page in half. "I spent months trying to save my inheritance," he said. "I never asked who paid for it before me." He placed the torn paper over the artificial lake. "I withdraw my consent to sell." Grant's face went still. Daniel moved beside Ruth. It was not forgiveness. It was a choice made where everyone could see it. The commissioners called for order. Helen requested that the register be sealed with the irons until a formal investigation could begin. Ruth held the book closed beneath her hand. "There is one more record." She removed Eli's letter. For most of her life, Ruth had protected her father's name as though love required silence. Now she understood that silence had been the inheritance he most regretted leaving her. She read the final paragraph aloud. "I kept the marks because I was afraid the county would destroy them. I kept the register because I was afraid the truth would destroy us. In the end, I protected the evidence and abandoned the people it belonged to. Ruth, if you find this, do not call my fear loyalty. Return what I was too weak to return." No one applauded. The truth was too heavy for applause. Helen asked for the letter. Ruth gave it to Lena first. Lena read Eli's signature, then carried the page to the county clerk. That small act decided who controlled the meaning of what had been found. Not the Calders, not the county, the people whose names had been erased. The commissioners voted to suspend the Red Mesa approvals, freeze transfers involving the disputed parcels, and appoint an independent title review. The branding irons would remain secured, but they would no longer remain hidden. Before the room emptied, Helen ordered the evidence cases opened for public photographic comparison under sheriff supervision. One by one, the black iron marks were lifted into the light. Lena stood beside the Wheatstem brand her mother had searched for all her life. She did not touch it. Not yet. First, every mark had to find its name. The first apology did not come from the county. It came from Walter Sloan 3 mornings after the hearing, when he carried 4 bankers' boxes into the church basement, where the affected families had begun meeting. He opened them, without asking anyone to forgive him. Inside were microfilm logs, clerk initials, transfer dates, and notes he had kept after retirement. He had spent 2 nights marking every place where an original owner's name disappeared between the second register and the public index. "I cannot restore the years," he said. "I can show where they were taken." Lena Ward gave him a legal pad. "Start with North 12. Walter sat down and began writing. That was how his redemption started, not with a speech, but with work. Helen Voss arrived with an independent title attorney. She announced that the branding irons would no longer be classified as abandoned county property. They would remain in joint custody with representatives chosen by the families until authentication was complete. She also suspended all development permits on disputed parcels. Grant Holloway objected before noon. The county denied him. Helen did not offer an apology for dead officials. Lena would not have accepted borrowed remorse. Instead, Helen signed 3 orders. The fence blocking the Ward Cemetery Road was opened. Water rights attached to the Ward Spring were frozen, so they could not be transferred into Red Mesa. And every family named in the second register had to receive notice before any title decision. Those orders did not return an acre, but the county could no longer decide without the people it once excluded. Sheriff Reed also requested that his office reopen the 1,935 evidence ledger. He found no inventory showing that the seized cattle had ever been returned or that sale money reached the accused families. He signed the correction himself and delivered copies door to door. It was not enough to erase the badge worn by his predecessor, but it placed the present office on record against the old lie. Daniel spent the next week mapping disputed boundaries from Eli's copies. He replaced Holloway's orange survey ribbons with plain cedar stakes marked only by parcel numbers. At the west pasture, he began removing the fence around the ward well. Lena watched beneath a cottonwood. "You do not have to tear down all of it," she said. "It was built to keep your family out. It may also have kept cattle from collapsing the stones." Daniel stopped. Eli's fence had preserved the well. It had also enforced the loss. Daniel left 3 rails standing for protection and opened a gate wide enough for Lena to pass. She walked to the well and placed her palm on the faded wheat stem mark. "My mother said the water tasted like iron in summer." Daniel lifted the cover. Cold air rose from below. The spring was still running. Lena filled a glass jar and carried it back to her truck. That was all she wanted from the well that day. The claims committee organized the first returns. Ruth had expected anger, but it did not arrive in one shape. Some descendants wanted acreage restored. Some wanted compensation. Others wanted access to graves, wells, and roads. Several wanted only the official record corrected so their grandparents would no longer be called squatters or thieves. One family refused to participate. Their grandfather had accepted money to testify against the others in 1935, and his descendants feared the register would expose him. The truth did not unite everyone. It gave them something real to disagree about. The first iron returned was the ward wheat stem mark. There was no ceremony. Sheriff Reed opened the evidence case. Helen documented the transfer. Walter verified the file number. Ruth signed away any claim created by her auction purchase. Then the iron was placed between Ruth and Lena. "My mother should be here," Lena said. "Yes." "So should your father." "Yes." Lena lifted the blackened handle. "I do not forgive him today. I did not bring it here to buy forgiveness." Lena wrapped the iron in the cloth that had protected the 1,933 tax receipt and carried it home. Over the following months, more marks found their families. Some went to descendants. Others remained with the trust when no direct heir could be confirmed. Walter attended every session. At the 4th, a man whose grandfather lost mineral rights asked whether Walter expected praise. "No," Walter said. "I expect to finish the index." He did. Daniel's public choice carried a cost. The bank froze credit on Calder Ranch while the review continued. Equipment was sold. The breeding herd went to a neighboring farm. Daniel gave up the apartment he planned to buy and moved into the room above the workshop. He never called it sacrifice. He called it the bill, arriving late. Ruth placed every disputed Calder parcel into temporary trust. She kept no right to sell, mortgage, or transfer those acres during the review. The farmhouse remained unresolved. One evening, Daniel found her beside the 7 packed boxes. "You can unpack." "Not yet. You think they will make you leave?" "They should be free to decide without worrying where an old woman will sleep. And if they let you stay, then staying will mean something different." Before winter, 61 families had received copies of the records, 14 lost names had been restored to the tax archive, and the county newspaper printed a correction beneath the old cattle theft headline. The word thieves was removed. The names were put back. Then Ruth received notice that the families had reached a decision about the farmhouse and about the last iron still waiting to be returned. 18 months after the hearing, Calder County still had no single answer for what should happen to the disputed land. The independent title review confirmed that the second register was authentic and that the 61 branding marks had once been accepted in place of written signatures. That did not make every case simple. Some parcels had been divided, sold, mortgaged, or inherited many times. Some descendants wanted land returned. Others wanted access to water, cemeteries, or roads their families had once used. 3 cases were still moving toward trial, but Red Mesa was gone. The artificial lake disappeared from the planning maps. The survey stakes were pulled from the west pasture. Holloway Development withdrew after lenders refused to finance a project built on frozen titles. Calder Ranch survived, though not in the form Ruth had inherited. The 118 ward acres entered a land trust. 2 other disputed sections followed. Ruth retained the farmhouse and 5 surrounding acres under a life tenancy agreement. She lost most of the grazing land and the expectation that the ranch would pass intact to Daniel. She signed every transfer herself. No one congratulated her. The signatures were too costly for celebration. Daniel stayed. At first, he stayed because Ruth needed help moving fences and sorting records. Later, he stayed because leaving would have meant treating the truth like another temporary crisis. He learned to read old survey stones. He worked beside Lena's grandson to reopen the path to the Ward well. On Saturdays, he helped place cedar posts along boundaries that existed before the substitute deeds. He no longer called the property Calder Ranch. He called it the Calder Place, inside the North Parcel Trust. Walter Sloan testified before the State Review Board. He surrendered his pension claim and turned over every private note from his years in the records office. Some families thanked him. Others refused to speak to him. Walter accepted both. Helen Voss remained county attorney long enough to establish a public claims process and transfer the surviving records to independent custody. She signed orders restoring cemetery access, reopening 2 water easements, and correcting the first 12 family names in the county index. Ruth kept Eli's letter in the cedar box Lena's mother had carried away from parcel N12. Some nights, she read it. Some nights, she left it closed. Loving her father no longer required turning him back into a hero. It meant remembering the whole man, the courage that preserved the evidence, the fear that kept him silent, and the final honesty that asked Ruth not to repeat him. The farmhouse roof was replaced before the next autumn rain. The county did not pay for it. Neither did a developer. Neighbors arrived with ladders, shingles, hammers, and food. Families named in the second register worked beside ranchers whose families had received replacement land. Old anger did not vanish beneath new roofing. It was simply a roof, a useful thing done together while harder questions remained. The branding irons were returned one by one after every mark was photographed and linked to surviving records. Some families hung them above fireplaces. One placed its iron beside a photograph of the woman who had used the mark because she could not write her name. Another used the shape to stamp clay markers along a reopened cemetery path. Several families left their irons with the land trust because no direct descendants could be found. There was no museum display. The irons had spent long enough separated from the people who understood them. The Ward wheatstem iron returned to Lena first. She carried it to the stone well, where the cedar growth had been cleared and the old cover repaired. The spring below was still cold. It had continued flowing while maps changed and fences moved. The final iron remained on the county table for 6 weeks. It carried the Calder mark, a broad letter C, crossed by a horizontal bar. The second register showed that this mark had replaced the Ward wheatstem on the substitute deed for the 118 acres. Ruth collected it without ceremony. She found Lena and Daniel waiting beside the well. Daniel had already driven a new cedar stake near the restored boundary. Ruth held out the Calder iron. "This should not stay with us," she said. Lena looked at the mark but did not take it immediately. "It is still part of your family's history. It became our history where yours was removed." Lena finally closed her hand around the worn wooden handle. She placed the Calder iron on the stone cover beside the wheatstem brand. 2 marks remained there. One showed the family that had been erased. The other showed the family that had benefited. Neither was hidden. Daniel handed Lena the wheatstem iron. She pressed it against the new cedar stake without heating the metal. The shape left only a shallow impression in the soft wood. It did not claim the land. It named the people who had once lived there. Ruth looked toward the farmhouse, the reopened path, and the fences moved back toward their older lines. The place was smaller than the ranch she had fought to save, but for the first time, its boundaries did not depend on someone else being forgotten. The branding irons had been called worthless once. Ruth never argued. She simply returned every mark to the name it had been taken from.